Hi, my name is Mike Bone. I'm a member of the Rocky Mountain Chapter of the North American Rock Art Society. This year our chapter is celebrating its 40th anniversary, and I've been fortunate enough to get to interview some members of our chapter who've been around since the very beginning, as well as some of the newer, younger members that are going to see our chapter into the future and help us redefine what rock gardening means to all of us. I hope you enjoy this retrospective of the last 40 years, and let's keep up the good work in rockin' the Rockies. Hi Marcia, thanks for being here. You've been such an inspiration to so many of us in the club. Why don't you tell us a little bit about how you got involved and what the club means to you?
Well, I've always been a plant nerd. My mom was a gardener, so I grew up gardening. But we moved here in 1987 from England, and it was so different. And I had gardened in California and in the Northwest, but not any place like this. So the first thing I did that winter is find the botanic gardens, and I started taking classes from the botanic gardens. Alan Taylor did a class on native plants, and I've always been interested in native plants. And so I took his class, and he talked about the rock garden. And so after that class, I walked around and I ran into Sandy Snyder working in the garden. And she's been retired for many years, but she was there for a very long time. And I started talking with her, and she said, "We have a volunteer program, why don't you join us?" And I didn't know there was an official way to do this, so the next Tuesday I just showed up and actually kept volunteering on Tuesdays till I earned a 500-hour pin. And I learned so much by volunteering in the gardens and meeting the people that worked there. And we talk about the plants, but I really think the Rock Garden Society is more about the people. This is our cult. Randy and my best friends are in the Rock Garden Society. So it's about both. It's about people and the plants. And we all learn from each other. And that was my initiation to gardening in this region.
Wow, that's fabulous. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi Randy, thanks for being here. You're professed as not a plant person, but you've been crucial to our organization for many, many years. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what keeps you coming back to the Rocky Mountain chapter?
Well, one of the things that I think I'm good at is organization, and plant societies need people who can organize rather than just be plant nerds. A lot of plant nerds don't know what organization is all about and how to make things work. So that's what I do. I am not a plant person, but one of the things that makes Rock Garden Society very important to me in my life is that there are hundreds of people who have hundreds of different kinds of backgrounds, and you can talk to them about many different things besides plants, but it always comes back to plants. The geology, physics, whatever it is, always comes back to the plants. And people organize their rock gardens according to the geology, according to the plant needs, and that just, it's the people. The people make the plant society, the rock garden society. And when you talk to someone from another continent who is interested in rocks and rock gardens and plants, especially the very small ones. I'm also interested in very small plants. Their eyes light up, and it's really nice to talk to someone who can be that involved and that passionate about something that we can all enjoy and agree with.
Hi, I'm Linda Boley. I met Paul Maslin when he was Dr. Maslin. He was the professor of comparative anatomy at CU, and then about 6 years later he became the curator of herpetology at the CU Museum, and I became the exhibit designer at CU. And we knew each other then, and I would pass his house quite often walking to campus and was intrigued with his rock garden. He would come out and we'd chat. He also knew I was interested in gardening, and he invited me to get together to drive to Denver about a rock garden group or starting something. I wasn't really too sure. Paniotti and Maslin and I would go drive all the way to Denver to the DVG, and have a meeting in the basement, and then the three of us would drive all the way back to Boulder. And I always kind of wondered why we were driving to Denver to have a meeting, and I was told that was we had to sort of sanction it with the Denver Botanic Gardens in order to be a full-fledged rock garden group. So anyway, and then I don't remember too much after that. I don't remember any paperwork, pretty much the three of us, and Paniotti can most likely speak to it more clearly. But Maslin was a great, great guy, and I really miss him.
Hi Ray, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the very beginning of the Rocky Mountain chapter.
Okay, I'm Ray Radabaugh. I live in Louisville, Colorado. And finally in maybe the early 1970s, there was a very nice article in the Boulder Daily Camera about Paul Maslin's garden. And I read that article and, oh, that's fantastic. I really need to see this garden. So I called up Paul Maslin and asked if I could come over and see his garden. And oh, he was very gracious. Oh yes, come on over and visit the garden. So he and Mary were very gracious hosts and showed me around. I was just fascinated by that garden. This is the kind of gardening that I really need to get into. And so then, I went back home and started trying to get more rock garden plants in. And lo and behold, Paul Maslin, called me up and asked how gardening was going. And I said, oh, fine. He asked if he'd come to my garden. Oh my gosh, he wants to see my garden. He came over and I showed him around, and nothing compared to his garden, but he was so nice, encouraging about getting into rock gardening. And he said, there's a men's garden club of Boulder that meets one night a month. Why don't you join? There's a few of us that are interested in rock gardening there, and sometimes we get together after and just talk about rock gardening. So I went to one of those meetings. There were actually more than one. And that's where I met Paniotti. Paniotti was also coming to those Men Garden Club of Boulder meetings. And so the three of us would kind of talk about the rock garden plants at those meetings. And then finally at one of those meetings, Paul mentioned about getting together at the Botanic Gardens to get a chapter started. And so now my memory, and there certainly could be some lapses and things that might not be quite right. Paniotti can, I think, probably correct any errors that I might make. But as I recall, then in 1976 was the Alpine 76. That was the first interim International Rock Garden Plant Conference. The international conferences were held every 10 years in Great Britain, and none of them were ever held in the U.S. And so the American Rock Garden Society wanted to have some meetings, international meetings, in the U.S. And so they decided to have an interim conference in between the 10 years of the international one. So that's why they call it the interim International Rock Garden Plant Conference. So the first one was held in Seattle in 1976. And one of the people that I know for sure was at that meeting was John Warman from Denver. And I'm pretty sure Paul Maslin also went to that. And it was at that meeting when Roy Davidson talked with John and Paul and said, oh, you ought to get a chapter started in the Denver area. Now, I don't think Paniotti was at that meeting in Seattle, but he can certainly correct me if I'm wrong. But at least those two anyway. So they came back and kind of talked about, let's get a chapter started. So it was then in the fall, and it may have been October, but I'm not quite sure. But that 76 meeting was in the summer, maybe June or July. So then I know I came down to Denver with Paul and Pondioti, and that's when I met John Warman. And there were some others at that first meeting that I don't remember how many there were exactly, not a lot, but a few members that we actually formed the chapter, and I got formed with the help of Roy Davidson. He came and was a speaker at that meeting then and helped us get started to actually form the chapter. So we got started with Paul Maslin as the first president of the chapter, and John Warman was the secretary. And we might have had some other position, but those are the two that I remember. So that's how I remember as far as our chapter actually getting started, and meeting in a room downstairs here at the Botanic Gardens. I think below Mitchell Hall. So anyway, that's my memories at this point as far as how we got started.
That's wonderful, thank you. Welcome, Panioti. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the beginnings of the Rocky Mountain chapter?
Very good. Well, it's fairly easy to do because it all started at a salmon barbecue in Vancouver. And the first interim international rock garden plant conference took place in Seattle and Vancouver in July of 1976. And I drove up. It was my first big adventure, driving by myself in my little Falcon. So I drove up separately, but Paul and Mary also went. I think they flew into Vancouver. So Paul and Mary were there. And it was a fabulous conference. We had I never dreamed that 10 years later we'd have it in Denver, but there were, back in 76, there weren't that many members of the Rock Garden Society in Colorado. I think we had 6 or 8. And Paul and I didn't even know most of the other members. And Paul and I had spent quite a bit of time together. He was a professor at the University of Colorado. He was a biologist, and he and I had spent quite a bit of time in the previous 5 or 6 years plant hunting around the West. And we always lamented the fact that there weren't very many other people that we could share it with in Colorado, And he said, well, there must be other people. Colorado's got quite a few people out there. There must be some other people who are interested. And I said, yeah, I think there must be, but how do we reach them? And so it was in Vancouver. We met one of the other people, and his name was John Warman. He was from Littleton, and so there suddenly were 4 of us, John, me, and Paul, and Mary at the meeting. And then we knew, of course, there was Ray, and there were some other people we knew about in the community, Linda. And we thought, well, maybe there's going to be some more. We had had such a good time in Seattle and in Vancouver, and we were eating this wonderful salmon in Vancouver, and we said, we should have a club. And so at the time we thought, well, we'll have an organizational meeting sometime in the fall. And as it turned out, it was in October. I think we settled upon. And Alan got us a room at the University of Colorado and the University Memorial Center. And so we had a couple of months to kind of build up to it. And I had befriended at the conference, after the conference, I ended up spending time with Roy Davidson, who was on the board of the Rock Garden Society. And part of the job of people on the board are to, encourage new groups. And so Roy was always wanting to come to Colorado, so he decided to come down to Colorado and be there for our organizational meeting. So this wonderful, extraordinary plantsman drove all the way down from Seattle, and we had that meeting, and everybody had to sign in. We had promoted it pretty well. I think we'd gotten it out to the local community pretty widely. And there were about 40 people there, most of whom we never saw again, but at least they showed up then. And Roy got up and he gave a wonderful little spiel about what rock gardening was all about. And he talked for a while, and I remember some of the things he said. It's really about gardening with nature and really working with native plants. He said all the things that we all sort of believe in, but it was great hearing it from an expert from outside of town. He was a very well-spoken, wonderful man. And so that was kind of our initial meeting, and the thing about that meeting that I remember particularly was that Homer Hill was there, and Homer had decided that year to grow 10,000 Aquilegia saximontana, or some outrageous number, I don't know, 1,000, 2,000. He had grown all these Aquilegia saximontana because he was going to market them. It was the bicentennial of the United States. And he figured this was a very patriotic native little plant, and he was going to, and so he had a special label made. And he had grown all these Aquilegia saximontananas. The only problem was that he was so busy with his carnation business, he forgot to kind of market it. Because it's an irresistible little plant that only blooms for a few weeks. And those happen to be very busy weeks in the nursery industry. So he had a lot of Aquilegia saximontana left over. And so he brought them to the meeting to share with everyone. And he brought way too many. We all took one home, but he still had a few flats of it. And Roy Davidson said, I'll take them back to Seattle and we'll sell them at our club there, and whatever we make we'll give you for your treasury. And so he carted them all the way back to Seattle. They sold, I don't know, it was 50 or 100, however many there were, and they charged a couple dollars each. So we suddenly had a treasury with a couple $100 thanks to that first meeting. And so that was, that kind of got us started.
Great, thanks a lot, PK. Hi, welcome back. Why don't you guys talk a little bit about the club in the early 80s and maybe talk a little bit about the rock garden here at DVG at that same time.
You want to start with the club?
Okay. Well, let me pick up right after the formation of the chapter in 1976. As I said before, I think Paul Maslin was the first president of the chapter, and then, but I don't remember whether it was for 1 year or 2 years. It might have been 2 years, and then I think Paniotti became the president, the second one, and I think maybe Andrew Pierce might have become president after that, leading up into the 80s. I became president sometime, I think, in the early 80s. And then finally we had our first national meeting in Boulder, Denver area, and I believe it was in 1982. And so we got used to organizing a conference, and it was at that conference that some of the national people encouraged us to think about having the second international one in 1986 in the Denver Boulder area. So we accepted that challenge and went ahead and started organizing this conference in 1986.
And I'd like to interject about conferences. By that time, when we had conferences, we were ready to roll, and the big draw was taking people to the mountains and showing them the flowers, because erythrichiums grow here, but people from around the world came here. One day for a conference, we decided we'd get the people up early, have them hike around the mountains, take them to a cowboy dinner, make them look at a cowboy show, and then they could go home. Well, they rebelled. They broke the doors of the bus down because they wanted to go home early. They didn't want to stay for any show, and they barely ate their dinner of hot dogs and beans. So we learned to back off and not wrap people around so much at conferences, but it's not a forced march. However, some people complained because they weren't seeing enough flowers. I'll never forget the 80-year-old lady who had to go on the expert hike because she didn't want to miss any flowers. And we tried to convince her that in Colorado you could see all the same flowers on an easy hike and on an expert hike. We had chase cars then to take people down because they suffered altitude sickness. Nobody knew much about altitude sickness at that time, but we made sure they knew it afterwards, and when they saw a few people get sick and had to be rushed to lower altitude, they decided to pay attention. So it was quite an experience.
Hey, why don't you tell us a little bit about the publication, Alpines 86?
Okay, well, in the process of organizing this Alpines 86 conference, someone came up with the idea, and I don't know who it was.
I think it was Andrew.
Andrew, okay. Why don't we have a publication? We publish a book and give it out to all the people that are registered for the conference. So we then formed a committee to do that. Probably started maybe a year and a half before the Alpines 86 conference to get that put together. And here is the publication that we came up with. The committee, the list of the committee members. Here I was the chairman of it. Deanne Hall was picture editor. Gwen Calades, the botanical editor. Panayoti Calades, the horticultural editor, and Patricia Pachuta was the technical editor. And well, I certainly want to mention that Panayoti, with all of his connections with people around the world and around the country involved, he was very much involved in getting all the people to write different chapters for the book. There's about 40 chapters in the book. And Lorraine was one of the writers for one of the chapters. This certainly was a lot of work. We had meetings of this committee and some other people probably almost once a week for a year in order to get it all organized. We did hire actually an editor for it, and she was the one, let's see, Jean Williams was the editor for it. She was the one that did kind of the maybe the day-to-day interaction with all the writers, and Timber Press, who is the company who actually published the proceedings. So anyway, you were one of the writers. I wrote one of the chapters too, but what was your experience in writing this?
It was the first thing I'd written since I'd been in college, and I hated every moment of it. But it's the nice thing about that book is it's an anthology of all different kinds of rock gardening experiences, plants, horticulture. It's just a wonderful book, and it's still quite current.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about the club in the 90s and some of the things that were happening then?
Well, one of the biggest things that happened in the 90s was we did a national meeting in 1993 at Vail, and we had 500 people sign up for that. So that was absolutely huge. It took the efforts of almost every single one of our club members to be involved in that, to be able to pull it off. It's just such a large number of people. It's just almost unmanageable. And also that year we had a late snowfall, so many of our hikes we were unable to actually complete. And so at the last minute we were changing things, including like we had helicopters. We were going to take people up to high alpine areas in helicopters. And the Forest Service wouldn't let us in because there was snow on the ground, and they were afraid the helicopters would damage the areas that were fragile that we were going to. But we were doing some really fun, big things in those days, and that's how Randy and I got involved with the National Society. We started going to the national meetings, and we didn't miss very many of them after that, and discovered that there's more people like us out there than just our local chapter, and we had so much fun. I mean, we saw things like Niagara Falls frozen because we went to Toronto in the middle of winter, where all your friends are saying, who would go to Toronto in the middle of winter but for study weekends? So our horizons just kept expanding, and we met more and more people, and that's one of the real benefits of the Rock Garden Society, is you meet people all around the world who are also interested in what you're interested in.
Great.
I'm here with Mike Kinchin. Mike, why don't you tell us a little bit about your early experiences in the rock garden?
Okay, so I first joined the Rock Garden Society in 1992 or 1993. My neighbor and mentor, Alice McBee, brought me to my first rock garden meeting, which ironically was in the Morrison Center here at Denver Botanic Gardens. And that's where I met Panayoti Calades, and it was right then and there that I knew that I wanted his job. And it's kind of worked out in some ways that I am now the curator of the Rock Alpine Garden. The Rock Garden Society was great. Early on, they allowed me to tag along to any of the meetings, plant sales, the garden tours. They were very kind and answered all my probably pretty silly questions when I was a kid. And often at each garden that we visited, they would send me home with a little plant to help me start my garden at home. So they were very supportive and a very loving group to be with.
Ken, thanks for being here today. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got involved in our chapter of the Rock Garden Society?
Well, I'm from Grand Junction, Colorado, born and returned there like a demented moth. And but when I was a young person, I gardened quite a bit, and there weren't close people to me there. There weren't, gardeners next door, and I didn't have access to the garden club or anything. But I got into it, and I would come over here for plant sales and things. So I had a little bit of access to the Rock Garden Club, the DBG's plant sale, and bought plants when I was a kid. And then when I moved out, I wound up meeting the club through finding the national club online, and then meeting different members who all said, you should come to one of these talks. It's all about the nerdy plant stuff you're into. And I came to one, and it was so much fun. There were so many cool people who knew a lot to teach everybody about that I wound up volunteering for the food post to supply the food for things after that. I was hooked into the club instantly.
Mike, why don't you tell us a little bit about your tenure in the rock garden here at DBG?
So I officially started in 2004 in the Rock Alpine Garden, and it was great to have the Rock Garden Society as a support system for what we do here at DBG. They were great with bringing in speakers that we normally wouldn't have access to. They've offered a lot of financial support to the Rock Alpine Garden here at Denver Botanic Gardens. You guys helped pay for a mapping intern in 2006 that allowed us to inventory and map the entire Rock Alpine Garden. You guys have recently just given some money for flow meters for an irrigation project in the Rock Alpine Garden. Additionally, you've just kind of provided an outlet and support system for what we do. And hopefully we also in turn inspire people to join the Rock Garden Society by creating a beautiful rock garden for people
Well, why
to
don't you
look
tell us
at.
a little bit about the 2010 meeting?
Okay, well, the Salida meeting in 2010, I was treasurer of the NARGS, the national group, at a time when the national group was losing money, and I decided that we needed to look at a different way to organize a meeting. Traditionally, they had meetings in big hotels and paid exorbitant rates for rooms and for the meals and everything, and so we chose Salida as a place that was near Alpines, a very small town, and we found a place that was brand new. They had not really had very many meetings at it, but they had a fixed rate for the rental rooms. And so we decided to not have a hotel, a main hotel. We would have people get their own room reservations. We would give them transportation and rent this room that was right on the Arkansas River for the meeting. And it worked out very well. We had a small number of people at that meeting. It was about 130, but it did make a little bit of money, and we didn't skimp on anything, and it just kind of broke the mold for the way the national meetings were held, and just became a model for how things should go or could go when you had declining memberships and smaller meetings.
You served about 6 years in a row on the board of our local chapter. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your experience with that?
So it was great. It was really fun and supportive. I had a wonderful board when I was on the board. Great vice presidents and other board members. Always very supportive, and it was great to bounce ideas off of people. It also allowed me to develop hopefully some pretty nice leadership skills that I'll be able to take further along with me in life. And overall, it was just a great place to kind of learn how to run a society. And I appreciate everyone's comments and feedback during my tenure. It was incredibly important for me and actually fun when I look back upon it.
Well, the Scottish trip was very interesting because we went to rent a bus, kind of one of those vans, and Paniotti signed up for the van, and then it ended up he was the only one that could drive it. So he had to drive the whole way and narrate the Scottish trip because he had some of these people that he wanted us to visit, and was one guy was the trough guy who was the post, wrote the stone column. And he was a famous person around here because Pagnotti had talked about him a lot of times.
Do you remember the woman whose garden was tombstones turned upside down?
Oh, yes.
She turned the tombstones from the graveyard upside down. Didn't use them for a rock garden, but used them for walking.
Her patio. She told the minister or the priest that she wanted these. He said, okay, but don't turn them right side up because then I'll have to take them away from you and it's not allowed. But she did have a few of them showing the skull and crossbones as on her patio. Yes, she was. So we met a lot of fascinating people from England and Scotland who just enhanced our rock gardening desires. We were just coming into be known, and we saw more of them in Scotland than we'd ever seen before. And we also saw the Grand Scree at Edinburgh Botanic Garden.
Hi, why don't you tell us a little bit about your field trip to the Bighorns?
I was a member of the chapter by then for several years, and Clark Coe, who was a member, and myself prepared this trip. We made all the organization and everything. And by the way, this is the same trip that they took this year as the pre and after conference, the Wyoming trip. So everything was prepared and we were to leave, and I'm calling the last members of the chapter to remind them to don't forget this or do this. And my husband had a heart attack and I could not go, so I never went on that trip. But in later years, he and I made a private trip and took the exact same route. And all I know is that anybody that went on that trip had a wonderful time, and Sandy made me a video of the participants on that trip singing to me and enjoying the flowers, and there are some nice photos on that too.
What year was that trip?
97.
Yeah. Was it 97?
One of the things I remember about it was Gwen leading singing, and of her, she called it Hymn to Kelsia on the bus. And then the other thing she did, which was hilarious, was our bus broke down on the last day, and she had everybody out on the grass waiting for the new bus to come, doing exercises. We did yoga and all sorts of stretches, and it was hilarious.
Well, that was when we also said the last person on the bus had to sing.
That's right.
And the last person was usually Lorraine Yates.
Most of the time. I know Fermi and I were juggling to be back before each other. That was a very fun trip. I think you, Sandy, and Pagnotti were actually the tour leaders for the trip, because I've got pictures.
Talk a little bit about your activity with the club and some of the things you've done.
Right. When I could, I took in as many lectures and things as I could because they were awesome national and international speakers. So I got totally addicted to that. And I was surprised when I started to be invited to actually share something. But the club provides tons of opportunities to provide and give. And there's a variety of big and small and serious and expensive or cheap things to do with the club. So there's no excuse not to get out there and do something fun. Like the wildflower tours, the unhikes. Our tours in the Bighorns were pretty cool. I'd never been to Wyoming and didn't know anything about the plants before the tour. By the end of it, I knew a heck of a lot more and knew a lot of people a lot better. It was a small, intimate tour in a really cool place. And it was a lot of fun with people and place, and the plants were also happened to be cool, you know. But the environment was just as much fun as the actual plant, and botanizing was a hoot. And I'm jazzed that the club and the national club are going to be doing more actual tours nationally and internationally. That's cool.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about the 2003 meeting in Breckenridge?
I'd love to talk about it. Again, I don't have all of the details, but I know what my part was. I was to be the guide trainer. And we spent 2 years before that conference training people from the Native Plant Society and the Rock Garden Society, which for me was a real coup to bring these two groups together. And we ended up with like 60 guides, all speaking botanic terms, scientific language, and we did field trips for those 2 years. It was just an amazing time, and it just produced this group of guides who were remarkable. They set the standard of excellence for the following conferences for every place. It was really, and for me, it was just special because I met so many neat people, and so many dear friends that are still dear friends came from that conference. That was a very important time in or highlight in my experience with the Rock Garden Society. Just the opportunity to show people how to speak botanically and how to learn to love all these alpines that we were seeing. The conference itself was excellent also because of the weather. We had wonderful weather for that particular trip.
Hi Kathleen, why don't you tell us about some of the wonderful field trips that you've helped organize and lead?
Well, I can. When all these other field trips were going on, I was still working, and I didn't have much chance to go to any of these places because of no days off, or I was short of money. So then one year I said, well, if other people can organize field trips, why can't I? And I get people to go someplace that I want to go, to come with me. So the first one, we had a speaker at a banquet, Stephen Jones, who had talked about the sandhills of Nebraska. So I thought, well, let's just see if I could ask him to meet us up there in the sandhills. So he agreed, and we organized a field trip to go up to the sandhills. And Linda was on this trip. That was the first one. And why don't you talk about I remember the highlight of that trip was astragalus with the big pods, colorful pods.
Ceramicus?
Ceramicus.
Yeah.
That was the highlight of the whole trip, was this astragalus with these big, huge, colorful pods.
And the blowout penstemon.
And the blowout penstemon, that's
lucky.
right. Go ahead, why don't you say
Oh, well,
something?
we just had a great trip. And I remember when we met up with Steve Jones, we had to go way back in on basically a non-traveling road.
Dirt road.
And when we got to meet him, we were in the middle of a major storm with tornadoes whirling around us that we were seeing in the background. And then Steve said, we got to get out now or it'll be flooded and we'll never get out. So we went through some pretty big mud puddles, which were really fun because they could spray up on both sides of the car. And I remember at the end of the trip, we left that van with more mud in it than anything. And we just figured that's their problem, not ours.
And then I organized a couple of other trips up to the Badlands of South Dakota. And that Joan and Gaza were on that trip, and that was a really beautiful trip. A woman from Hot Springs, South Dakota, Cindy.
I forget her last name.
She's a member.
She and her husband, they're life members for this chapter.
Right, and I'm ashamed for my.
Yeah, I can't think of the name either. But anyway, they came along and showed us many nice places to find wildflowers. And we spent, a day and a half or two at the Badlands.
2, yeah.
And we had, the Badlands is a national park. And we had a botanist that was assigned to us to walk us around there and show us things. So that was all very informational.
And the highlight of that trip was, I should have looked this up before was another astragalus. It was growing on this huge clay surface.
So Mike, you recently put together an incredible meeting for the national chapter in Steamboat Springs. Why don't you tell us a little bit about how that came about and a little bit about the meeting?
Sure. So as we all know, the meeting came about pretty quickly. NARGS really needed a chapter that had ran meetings in the past and had a good track record of producing good meetings to step in and host the meeting. So we stepped in and did it, and I thank everyone from the Rock Garden chapter here in Denver for coming together to help us put that together. Also, everyone in Steamboat Springs was great. There were a lot of people that actually aren't in the Rock Garden Society that pitched in to help make it a great meeting. And I was just recently in Canada, and I'm still hearing glowing reviews from the meeting. So thank you everyone who helped make it probably one of the better meetings the NARGS has had, is what several people told me. So we couldn't have done it without you guys, so thank you.
Why don't you guys tell us a little bit about the unhikes?
You want to say anything about the unhikes?
We have a member in this chapter, her name is Dawn Mitchell. And Dawn Mitchell volunteers at Mount Goliath and is very well versed with lots of wildflowers. And she has a passion for going places, checking out where it's not required that you even walk. She brings a chair with you can sit if you're somehow mobility challenged.
That's what the hikes are mostly for people that can't get around very well.
She also is a member from the Colorado Mountain Club, and they have something they call
Monoculars.
monocular.
Monox, yeah.
And with that, you can sit, you drive up, you get out of the vehicle, and if you can only make 3 steps, there's a chair for you to sit.
That's
You
me.
get yes, and you can see all what she points out right around you, all the wildflowers. So in this chapter, it is possible to go on hikes even if you can't walk or anything. If you don't walk, so that is a wonderful opportunity for lots of people that are like us, a little bit challenged when it comes to hiking.
The thing she did was order twice as many plants as Pete ever did.
And I didn't know a thing about it.
And these plants kept coming and coming and coming. And I was thrilled, and I thought, oh gosh. And she did it every year. They ordered twice as much as they did the year before. They made the rock garden booth like the biggest booth in the whole sale after a while. It was wonderful.
And we still do.
Yeah.
We don't order the
Still do.
plants anymore, but we're still
They're still there.
involved in it.
Yeah.
35 years is a long time to sell plants.
Yes, you know what you're
Okay,
doing.
this is our group eating lunch. What's the name of this place, you guys? Cottonwood. Cottonwood in Nebraska, and we have gourmet lunches to eat. There's Andrew. I'm panning on to Linda, and then there's people on the other side of the table. I'm coming up, and somebody wants to be in this movie. Everybody wave now. I'll pan around here, and there we have somebody waving. That's Deborah, and there's Ellie. And Fran is staying covered with her back to us, and you can tell Randy from the back. Or the top, actually. Yeah. He has hair in the back.